You don't know my name. You don't know my face. I am Shadow West. Sit down. Let's play. He arrived on a Wednesday morning in October. Harrow Creek was gone. Not abandoned, not quiet, not half-empty the way boom towns went when the silver ran out. Gone. Burned. The foundations were cold and blackened. The well had collapsed. What had been a church was now a stone chimney standing in a field of ash. He checked the letter. He checked his compass. He checked his maps of the territory. This was Harrow Creek, or it had been. His name was Elias Voss. He was a cartographer, 31 years in the profession, 4 states, surveying companies, railroad men, small towns that hired him to put themselves on the official record, to be acknowledged by the world as real, as existing, as worthy of the permanent language of ink and paper. He was good at it. He was meticulous. He charged what the work was worth. He lived simply. He never, in 31 years, submitted a map he was not proud of. He was, as far as anyone knew, very much alive. He made the map anyway. He stood in the ash, and he worked from memory, from the shapes of the foundations, the spacing of the chimneys, the width of what had been the main street. He walked the ruins with his measuring chain and his compass, and he drew Harrow Creek as it had been, not as it was. He spent 2 days on it. The wind picked up while he worked. He did not feel it. When he submitted the map to the county office in Reno, explaining that the town no longer stood, but that its official record should still be filed, the clerk took it without much interest. The clerk stamped it with a date and put it in a drawer. Elias rode home. He noted the commission in his ledger. He moved on. He made inquiries. That was the professional thing to do. He rode to the nearest settlement, a small ranch town called Bitter Fork, 8 miles east, and he asked about Harrow Creek. The woman at the general store looked at him, or rather, she looked at a point just past his shoulder while she answered, as if addressing someone standing behind him. He assumed she was distracted. He did not think about it again for a long time. She told him Harrow Creek had burned the previous spring. April, she thought. Maybe March, a fire that had started in the saloon and taken everything in under 2 hours. The speed of it had surprised people. No one had died. They had all gotten out, but nothing was left. Most of the residents had dispersed to other towns. A few had stayed in the county. The county office would have the records. If he needed them, he thanked her. He rode back to Harrow Creek. The second commission came 6 weeks later. Millhaven, Utah Territory. Population, 207. Survey required for postal registration. Standard terms. He arrived on a cold Tuesday in November. Millhaven was ash. Not recent ash. The fire here had been older, months at least. The winter had rained on it. The grass was beginning to grow back through the black soil. But Millhaven was, without question, gone. He stood at what had been the entrance to the town. He could tell from the stone gateposts, still standing, and he felt the first real unease take hold of him. Not alarm. Not yet, just a quiet, uncomfortable recognition that something was wrong with his circumstances. 2 towns, 2 ruins, 2 commissions he had accepted in good faith. He made the map. He could not help it. The work was still the work. He walked the ruins. He measured. He drew. He submitted the record. and he noted the commission, and he rode home. And then, because he was a precise man, a methodical man, a man who kept very good records, he opened his ledger and looked back through the years. In 31 years of work, Elias Voss had completed 47 commissions. He wrote to the county records offices of each one. He received 39 responses over the following 3 months. 34 of the towns were fine. They existed. They had grown or shrunk or held steady, but they were there. He could have ridden to them and found the streets exactly as he had drawn them. 5 of them had burned, not all recently. The oldest fire had taken a town called Gray's Hollow 8 years ago. Before that, a settlement called Crale Junction 11 years prior, then 3 others scattered across the years, each one a town he had surveyed, each one reduced to nothing. He sat with this information for a long time. A cartographer is a man of reason. He does not leap to conclusions. He examines his data, and he looks for what the data suggests, and he does not allow his imagination to propose explanations that the data does not support. But the data was suggesting something that reason did not want to receive. He stopped accepting commissions. That was the first thing he did. He wrote to the 2 inquirers currently in correspondence with him, and he declined their business, politely, without explanation. Then he sat in his office for several days, and he thought. The question he kept returning to was not the one that seemed most pressing. The question that seemed most pressing was, am I causing this? But that was a question he could not answer yet. So he set it aside. The question he kept returning to, the one that would not leave him alone, was simpler and stranger. Why do the commissions keep arriving for towns that no longer exist? He had received 7 commissions in the past 2 years, 7 letters on various kinds of paper, with various kinds of handwriting, each requesting a survey, each one legitimate in appearance, each one offering a reasonable fee, each one for a town that, when he arrived, was a ruin, but he had been paid, not in advance. Cartographers rarely worked that way. He had submitted his maps, and the fees had arrived, postal orders, bank drafts, once a sealed envelope of bills left at his post office box. He had deposited them without thinking. He had the receipts. He had eaten breakfast that morning. He believed he had. When he tried to recall what it was, the memory was a shape with nothing inside it. Who was paying him? Who was commissioning surveys of towns that no longer stood? He spent a week attempting to trace the payment sources. 3 were untraceable. 2 led to bank accounts that had been closed. 1 led to a name, Aldric Vance, that appeared in no census, no land record, no business register he could find in 4 territories. He had stared at the handwriting on Vance's letter for some time before he understood what was bothering him. The slant, the spacing, the particular way the letter V was formed. It was close to his own hand, not identical, but close enough that a man who did not know his writing would not have noticed the difference. He told himself that many men wrote similarly. 1 led somewhere he had not expected. One of the payments had been drawn on a bank in Crale Junction. Crale Junction, which had burned 11 years ago, which no longer had a bank, which no longer had anything. He went to the bank. The building in Crale Junction that had been the bank was a stone shell, 4 walls, no roof, no floor. He went to the nearest branch of the parent institution in a city 40 miles north, and he asked about the account. The clerk looked at him with an expression he would remember for a long time. Not concern, not suspicion. Something quieter than either of those things, the clerk told him carefully. The account had been dormant for 11 years. The account holder had died in the fire that took Crale Junction. The account had never been closed, oversight, most likely, but it had certainly never been used to draw a bank draft. Not in 11 years. Not in 30 years if it came to that. The clerk asked if Elias was feeling all right. He left without answering. He sat on his horse outside the bank for a very long time. A man of reason, a methodical man. He rode back to his office, and he opened his current correspondence file, and he found the most recent commission. He held the letter up to the window light, and he read the name of the town being requested. Dunmore Wells, Wyoming Territory. He had never heard of it. That was not itself unusual. He did not know every small settlement in the West, but when he checked his atlas, the Comprehensive Territorial Survey published in 1884, Dunmore Wells did not appear. He wrote 3 letters. He waited. No county office in Wyoming had any record of a town by that name. He accepted the commission anyway. He told himself he was gathering evidence. He told himself he was a professional, and this was research. He told himself a great many things. In the 2 weeks he spent preparing to ride for Wyoming, what he did not tell himself was the truth. He accepted because he could not stop, because whatever was happening to him, the work was still the only language he had ever fully spoken. He could not refuse a commission any more than he could refuse to breathe. He put the letter down. He picked it up again. He was not a man who paced. He paced. He was not a man who talked to himself. He stood at the window of his office for 20 minutes, and he spoke aloud. He went through the facts in order, arranging them the way he arranged a survey. The conclusion they kept pointing to was the same conclusion he kept refusing. After 20 minutes, he stopped speaking. There was no arrangement of the facts. That changed what the facts were saying. He found Dunmore Wells, or what was left of it. The ruins here were different from the others. Not ash and blackened timber. These were older than the fire should have made them. The foundations had been overgrown. The well in the town center had collapsed so long ago that a young tree was growing up through it. Whatever had happened to Dunmore Wells, it had happened many years ago, possibly decades. And yet the commission had arrived 3 weeks prior. The handwriting on the letter was fresh. The paper was fresh. He made his camp at the edge of the ruins, and he did not sleep that night. He lay awake, and he thought about everything he knew, laid out in order. He arrived at a conclusion that he did not like, but that seemed, in the cold logic of 3 in the morning, to be the only one available. Someone knew what he would find before he arrived. Someone was sending him to these places deliberately. Someone who knew which towns had burned. Someone who was, for reasons he could not yet determine, building a record of the dead. A cartography of destruction, using him as the instrument. He did not believe in curses. He did not believe in the supernatural explanation that a less rational man might have reached for. He believed in persons. He believed in intent. Someone, somewhere, with knowledge of the past and access to legitimate-seeming financial instruments, was orchestrating these commissions. He spent the next month trying to find that person. His search led him, eventually, to an old man named Pemberton. Pemberton lived alone in a rotting house outside of Carson City, Nevada. He had once been, 30 years prior, a land surveyor. Pemberton knew about the commissions. He had heard of the pattern. Rumors traveled fast among the small, quiet community of territorial surveyors. He was also, Elias noticed, frightened, not of Elias himself, of something else, of a subject he had clearly been trying not to think about for a very long time. Over 2 evenings and a great deal of whiskey, Pemberton told him what he knew. There had been others, other cartographers, other men who had received commissions for towns that, upon arrival, proved to be ruins. It had happened before Elias, and before Pemberton, and before a surveyor named Marsh, who had ridden the same territories in the 1860s. The pattern was old. It had been documented in fragments in the professional correspondence of 3 generations of Western mapmakers. None of them had ever spoken of it publicly, because none of them had wanted to be thought insane. Each of them, Pemberton said, had eventually received one final commission, a commission for their own hometown. None of them had completed it. Elias asked what had happened to those men. Pemberton looked at his glass for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "That is what I have never been able to determine. They simply stopped corresponding. They stopped working. They disappeared from all records." He looked directly at Elias and he said, "Has it come for you yet?" Elias reached into his coat and removed the most recent letter he had received. 3 days before his visit to Pemberton, he laid it on the table. Pemberton read the town name. His face went very still. He did not say anything else that night. The town on the letter was called Harland's Rest, Wyoming Territory. Elias had been born there. He had grown up there. He had left at 22 to begin his career, and had not been back in over a decade. He told himself he would not go. He told himself this for 11 days. Then he packed his case. He loaded his horse. He began the 4-day ride northeast. Harland's Rest was not ash. That was the first thing he noticed. The structures were standing, weathered but intact. The church still had its roof. The schoolhouse still had its bell. The general store still had glass in 2 of its 3 windows. Harland's Rest had not burned. He rode slowly down the main street, and he looked at everything, the storefronts, the houses, the alley between the blacksmiths and the tannery where he had played as a boy. He felt the peculiar double sensation of recognition and wrongness. Everything was exactly as he remembered, and everything was empty. No one had been here in a very long time. The dust on the boardwalk was undisturbed. The signs above the storefronts were faded past legibility. The water in the trough at the center of the street was black and stagnant. He climbed off his horse, and he walked to the door of the building that had been his father's house. He pushed it open. Inside, on the table, was a map, rolled, tied with twine, the way he always tied his finished maps. He stood in the doorway for a very long time. Then he walked to the table. He untied the twine. He unrolled the map. It was Harland's Rest, every street, every building, every lot, every fence line, every well and water channel. His handwriting in the margins, his notation system. his scale marks, his compass rose, his signature in the lower right corner with the date. He stared at the date. It was 17 years ago. He had not visited Harland's Rest in 17 years. He had not drawn this map. He had not been here. He turned the map over. On the back, in a different hand, not his hand. Not any hand he recognized, a single line. You finished this the night before the fire. You do not remember because you were already gone. He put the map down. He walked out of the house. He stood in the street of Harland's Rest, and he began, for the first time in 31 years of professional observation, to truly look at what was around him. The dust on the boardwalk was undisturbed. His boots had not disturbed it. He looked back at the path he had walked from his horse to the house. The dust lay unmarked, as if he had not walked there. He looked at his horse. It was facing the wrong direction. He had no memory of it turning. He did not think about this for very long. He had trained himself over the years not to think about certain things for very long. He looked at the trough. Black water. Still. He looked at the church at the end of the street. His memory said it was white. He could not read its color now. Not in this light, not with this sky. He began to walk toward it, and then he stopped, because he realized he was not casting a shadow. The sun was low in the west. Everything cast a shadow. The church cast a shadow. The trough cast a shadow. The sign above the general store swayed slightly in a wind he could not feel, and its shadow moved across the boardwalk, back and forth, back and forth. He had no shadow. He looked at his hands. He turned them over. They were his hands. The calluses in the right places. The ink stain on his right forefinger he had for 20 years. His hands. But when he pressed his right thumb against his left palm, he felt nothing. He pressed harder. He watched his thumb pressing. He saw no impression in the skin. He felt nothing at all. He sat down in the middle of the street of Harland's Rest, in the dust that would not record his presence. He tried to remember the last time he had eaten a meal. He could not. He tried to remember the last time he had slept. He could not. He tried to remember arriving in Carson City to visit Pemberton. He could remember the conversation. He could remember the table, the candle, the letter laid on the wood. He tried, briefly, to recall the last time someone had spoken his name out loud. Not in a letter, not in a formal transaction. Someone had looked at him and called him by name. He could not remember it. He tried harder. He could not. He could not remember the road there. He could not remember the road back. He could not remember any road, any meal, any bed. He could not remember anything between the commissions. He could not remember anything between the maps. He understood, eventually, not all at once. The mind does not accept certain things all at once. It approaches them the way a man approaches a fire, from a distance first, then closer, then standing before it, then finally acknowledging the heat. He understood, eventually, that the fire had taken Harland's Rest on the 14th of October, 1870, that it had been fast, that it had begun in the building that was now his father's house, his house, the one where the map had been waiting on the table. He understood that the map on the table was the map he had been working on the night the fire started, that he had completed it in the hours before dawn, that he had gone to sleep at his table, in his chair, over the finished work. He understood that he had not woken up. He had been 37 years old, and he understood. This was the last and heaviest thing. What had followed was not 31 years of professional life. There had been no 31 years. There had only been the work, the endless, compulsive, purposeless work of a man who did not know he was dead, still doing the only thing he had ever known how to do, still mapping, still measuring, still submitting his records to county offices that had no memory of receiving them. The payments he had received were not payments. The ledger he kept was not a ledger. The letters were not letters. They were the remnants of an intention, the ghost of a professional life. He had been mapping the dead towns because he was one of them. He had been sent by whatever force sends the dead on their rounds to make a record, a final accounting, an official document, the official document of every place that had been lost the same way he had been lost, quickly, in the night, without anyone making a proper record of what had stood there. And now the record was almost complete, all but one. He went back inside the house. He sat at the table. The map of Harland's Rest was there, finished, already done, drawn the night he died, in his own hand, faithful and precise, every detail in its place. It had been waiting for 17 years for someone to submit it. He understood now that there was no county office that would receive it. There was no postal system, no drawer, no clerk. The record would not go anywhere, but he folded it, and he tied it, and he put it in his case, because he had always finished what he started, because the work was the work, because whatever he was, whatever was left of a man called Elias Voss, who had died in October of 1870 in a building that no longer stood, in a town that no longer stood. This was the last thing that remained of him. This precise, faithful, meticulous attention to the shapes of things. This refusal to leave a place unrecorded. He closed the case. The room went dark, not the dark of night, not the dark of storm, the dark of an absence, of something that had been present for a long time, finally finishing what it needed to do. The dust on the floor of the house in Harland's Rest lay perfectly undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there at all. They found his office empty eventually, or rather, they found that no one could quite remember when it had last been occupied. His name appeared in county records in 4 states, attached to dozens of filed surveys, some dating back decades. The surveys were precise, they were faithful, they were, as far as anyone could determine, excellent work. No one could find the man who had made them. No one could find, in any census or tax record or birth register, any evidence that a cartographer named Elias Voss had ever existed at all. But the maps were there, every town accounted for, every ruin named, every lost and forgotten place rendered faithfully in his exact and careful hand. A complete record of everything that had burned, all but one map, the last one, was ever found. They never found the map of Harland's Rest. No one thought to look for it. No one remembered that Harland's Rest had ever stood. No one remembered Elias Voss either.